Should I start, Madam?
Yes, madam, come.
I can't see the entire thing.
Yes, she
Yes,
has
good
come.
evening. Good evening, everybody.
Good
Yes,
evening,
you can
madam.
start.
Okay, thank you, Madam. A very good evening to all present today. The American poet Dorothy Parker had once said, "The cure for boredom is curiosity. There is no cure for curiosity." Under such trying circumstances now, with a raging pandemic and intermittent lockdowns, it is extremely necessary to find this cure. The Department of English is happy indeed to present its first online students seminar, encouraging the students to be curious for now and forever. Today we have 5 paper presenters only from the UG section of the department, especially from the semesters 2 and 4. Now I would request our Honorable Principal Madam, Dr. Shoma Bandhopadhyay, who has taken time out of her busy schedule, to be present here today with us to deliver her welcome address. Madam.
Good evening, my beloved students, my dear colleagues from different departments. It's really a very encouraging session and encouraging effort also to keep our beloved students mentally fit and out of their boredom. So today we are here to listen to you about some new things, about some of your new thoughts in a new virtual medium, which maybe now we are a bit practiced, we are a bit accustomed with this medium, but still many thing is new and many thing we will search out, and I'm sure that this kind of session will ultimately encourage our students and will ultimately enlighten them and will give them courage to do something new and to do something creative. So congratulations to department for arranging this kind of seminar, and I'm sure that this seminar will be very much successful one, and all of us we will enjoy it very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Yes, indeed, the students have tried their best to find resources for their papers from home through online. Now, I would like to introduce our respected guest for today. We have amongst us Dr. Rudrashish Dotto, who has graciously consented to supervise the webinar. Dr. Rudrashish Dotto is presently Assistant Professor in English and IQAC Coordinator at Pritilata Vadedar Mahavidyalaya, Nodia, West Bengal. He has worked on Sri Aurobindo's poetry for his PhD in the Department of English, Calcutta University. His areas of interest include Sri Aurobindo studies, pedagogy, and Indology. He also teaches courses at the PG level in the PG departments of English at St. Paul's Cathedral College and our Narasingho Datta College too. A very warm welcome to you, sir, and we sincerely hope you enjoy
Thank you.
the students' presentation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here today.
Thank you, sir. Now, I would like to call upon Dr. Shruti Lahiri to take us through the next part of the webinar. But before that, I would like to remind our students to keep their microphones muted and their cameras off throughout the session. And please keep in mind that you will not present or share your screen while the webinar is going on. Thank you so much. And now to Dr. Shruti Lahiri to take the webinar on.
Thank you, Professor De. And thank you, madam, for a very inspiring address to all our students. Thank you, Dr. Datto, for coming and here to encourage our students. And thank you, Momita. It would be my pleasure to make you all aware that this webinar session does not deal with one common theme from English literature, but indulges in different topics taken from the syllabus of undergraduate English. Hence, a very short questionnaire session will follow each paper. So I would like to invite and request Dr. Datta and the audience to unmute your mics after the paper is over and put forward your valuable comments, observations, and questions, if any, to each presenter at the end of his or her paper, instead of writing questions in the chat box. Thank you all. Thank you once again. So I would henceforth proceed to invite our first speaker, Debaruti Bera, to talk on her topic is the personal and the public, the metaphysics of dance. Good morrow. So Debaruti, please start presenting your paper. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. In this platform, the title of my paper is The Personal and the Public, the Metaphysics of Dance. Good morrow. There is an anxiety between Donne's personal utterance as a poet and public figure as a courtier. His personal life is representative of the macrocosm of British imperialism. The tension arises through his representation of the macrocosm of his personal life, which actually is representative of Elizabethan imperialism. According to the poem, let sea discovers to new world have gone. Let maps to other worlds on worlds have shown. Let us possess one world, each hath one and is one. The imperialism is represented by the following lines. Where can we find two better hemispheres without sharp north, without declining west? He uses his poetic abilities to suppress colonial brutality, which marked the Elizabethan age. He structures his poem as a love poem, but a closer scrutiny reveals that unwittingly, Donne remaps the body politic to a description of his mistress' body. My face in thine eyes, thine in mine appears, and true plain hearts do in the faces rest. This is a simple love poem, but actually this is a colonial poem. We can see it following lines. I wander by my troth, what thou and I did till we loved, were not wind till then. The style is apparently colloquial, but in reality it is menacing. Therefore, this poem is a personal statement about this poem is about aggression. For instance, when the Puritans reached America, they murdered the Native Americans. When they reached India, they killed us and colonized us. The human body is compared to a map. Thus we have in America, Newfoundland. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Debaruti. You have thought on this aspect of colonialism or imperialism as one would understand it at your undergraduate level. And my only question to you is, do you believe that Donne wrote this poem specifically to express his concern about increasing or growing human cost of colonialism, which was he was beginning to see at his at some point midway in his life. Do you think that this poem is actually an expression of his concern?
Sir, I think that this is an expression of colonial brutalism. Actually, my first at first I was told that it is a love poem.
Yes.
So I think that he represent it as a colonial brutality. On that time, seafarers uh, was going on many countries to uh, to
I get your point. I get your point. So yes, it's a well thought out paper, but this is a general statement to all of you. It's very commendable that you are thinking on these lines at your level of undergraduate studies. And I do hope that you will pursue on these interesting aspects of John Donne or the metaphysical poets as you progress on with your concern with English studies, right? Thank
yes,
you.
sir.
If there are other questions from other participants today, you may please unmute yourself and ask.
Hello, Debaruti.
Yes,
May I
sir.
ask you a question?
Yes, sir. Obviously.
Would you like to comment on this? How does the Good Morrow engage the metaphysics of love? If it is primarily a love poem, as you said, how does the text of the poem, as you have read into it, how does it affect the question of the metaphysics of love? Can you throw just a bit of light on that?
Yes, it's a simple love poem because the the at first time I am told that the poet is concerned about this love poem. He is concentrate to write that this simple love poem, and she concentrate on writing this that to thinking about the colonialism. She described this a body politic in this case. So I think that this is a simple love poem, but in this poem there is a thinking of body politics.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, any more questions or observations to be addressed? Thank you, Debaruti. Thank you, Kuntalda. Thank you, Dr. Datta.
Welcome, ma'am. Welcome, everyone.
So, shall I proceed to the next speaker?
Yes, we can proceed to the next speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Datta. So, our next speaker is Swapnil Mukherjee. He will be speaking on Gray's Elegy as a poem on life as much as a poem on death. Yes, Swapnil, you may start.
Good morning, everyone.
Hey, good morning, Kire.
Very sorry. Good evening, everyone. I, Swapnil Mukherjee, is going to present my paper on Gray's Elegy as a poem on death as much as a poem on life. Now, Elegy, written in a country churchyard, is a poem by Thomas Gray, completed in 1750 and first published in 1751. Although the poem's origin is unknown, it was partly inspired by Gray's thoughts following the death of the poet Richard West in 1742. In English literature, an elegy is a poem of serious reflection, usually a lament for the dead. But Gray's elegy is an elegy in name but not in form. It employs a style similar to that of contemporary odes, but it embodies a meditation on death and remembrance after death. The poem argues that the remembrance can be good and bad, and the narrator finds comfort in pondering the lives of the obscure rustics buried in the churchyard. It was earlier titled as Stanzas Wrote in a Country Churchyard, but the two versions approach death differently. As stanzas contain a stoic response to death, the final version, that is elegy, contains an epitaph which serves to repress the narrator's fear of dying. One of the best known poems about death in all of European literature is Gray's Elegy, as the poem brings out the reflections of an observer who, passing by the churchyard that is out in the country, stops for a moment to think about the strangers buried there. Scholars of medieval times sometimes kept human skulls on their desktops to keep themselves conscious of the fact that someday they, like the skull's former occupants, would die. From this practice, we come to know about the phrase memento mori, which is any token one uses to keep one's mortality in mind. In this poem, the graveyard acts as a memento mori, reminding the narrator to not place too much value on this life because someday he too will be dead and buried. The speaker of this poem is surrounded by the idea of death, and throughout lines 1 to 28, there are the images of the ringing of a curfew bell, a herd of cattle moving across the pasture, a farm laborer returning home, and certain other images which eventually point out the contrast between life and death. As the mentioned churchyard in the title establishes the theme of mortality, the poem itself begins with images of gloom and finality. The darkness at the end of the day, the forlorn moan of lowing cattle, the stillness of the air, highlighted by the beetle's stilled motion, and the owl's nocturnal hooting, all serve to set a background for this serious meditation. However, it is not until the fourth stanza that the poem actually begins to deal with the cemetery mentioned as the place where the village forefathers sleep. This elegy presents the dead in the best light. Their families adored them, and they were cheerful in their work as they hummed the woods beneath their steady stroke. The speaker openly admits that they are spoken of so well precisely because they are dead. Because death is such a terrible thing that its victims deserve the respect of the living, and the living should respect them with their sorrow, which is evident from line 90. Some pious drops the closing eye requires. Gray's elegy, alongside portraying the theme of death, also eventually highlights the life of the unsung human beings because death would never have been so mournful and remembering the dead so worthy of condolent retrospection had there been no life, no simple human joyousness of day to day participation in life. In the poem, the speaker emotively recollects what the lives of these simple men were like, their relations with their wives and children, the soil they had tilled, the horn sounded while gaming, the herds blazing in the evening, and so on. They are not defined by their possessions because they had few, and instead are defined by their actions, which serve to contrast their lives with the quiet and resigned existence in the graveyard. In lines 73 to 76, the speaker continues, as he does in the previous stanzas as well, his praise of the simple life of common people. They are far from the madding crowd of city and political life. Madding here can mean either maddening, that is the source of madness or insanity, or it can mean mad, that is, the crowd is itself hatefully insane. In either case, the common country people were distant from this insane world. As a result, they never strayed into the immoral acts of the powerful. Instead, they kept steadily to their simple but meaningful lives. Underlying the regretful reflection on life falling into death and consecrated in the confinement of the grave, there is a vindication of the unpolluted lives of the dead. In lines 85 to 88, the speaker reasons that most people, faced with the prospect of dying and ultimately being forgotten, cling to life. In the 86th line, Gray uses the paradox, this pleasing anxious being. On the one hand, being or living can be anxious, filled with worries. On the other hand, just being alive when faced with death is itself pleasing. Thus, the speaker is suggesting that even the troubles and worries of life are enjoyable in comparison to death. To conclude, Gray in his elegy highlights the idea that amidst the knowledge of the inevitability of death, human beings still celebrate life with all its merriment and all the simple obligations of lived existence. This is a unique poem of condolence insofar as it interweaves the joys and pains of life with its predestined termination in death. Such poems like Tennyson's In Memoriam and Keats's Ode to a Nightingale explored the idea of death vis-a-vis life, but Gray's elegy celebrates the simple rural life of the unchronicled country people while simultaneously lamenting over their death, eventually developing a stoic response to death and validating remembering the dead. Gray's elegy is thus more than an elegiac poetic discourse on death, it rather strongly holds on to the annals of life as well. Thank you all.
Thank you, Swapnil, for your thoughtful commentary on religion. One question comes to my mind. It's more of a request to get your opinion. Do you believe, after reading Gray's Elegy, that the entire poem is actually a poetic exercise to somehow circumvent or replace the poet's personal fear of dying? Do you believe that it's an exercise to somehow replace or circumvent the
Sir,
poet's personal fear?
could you repeat 1 second because actually my network is having certain problems
Yes.
right now.
Do you think that this elegy is a poem which it's a poetic exercise which somehow is designed to circumvent or to replace the poet's own personal fear of dying?
Yes, obviously, because actually it is what I believe is it's a moral truth that we all human beings are, we have, since we're living, so we all will die someday. So somewhere poet Thomas Gray too feels that, and that is why he gradually, eventually goes on to this realization that yes, we have to enjoy our lives. Yes, definitely life is all about merriment and enjoyment with utter practicality, but we should at least not fear death, but rather we should enjoy each and every worries and troubles of life, which even when we die, that at least we can die peaceful. That yes, we have enjoyed our lives, we have led our lives, and now now we can die peacefully. So somewhere I believe that yes, he not only fears, but also somewhere he kind of realizes that yes, life will come to an end, and there is absolutely, it's inevitable, we can't help it. I believe this.
Okay. Thanks.
Yes, so any other observations?
I would just like to observe over here, Shopnil, the poem is so relevant even today. Like when we are facing death almost every day around us now in this pandemic, and still we are holding on to life, and life is giving us, and the different little aspects of life still giving us meaning to continue even when we are faced with such depressing sights all around us. And then you come to a poem like this, which is moving sort of from death to life, from an affirmation of life and its vitality. So it makes it, even if it is written so many years earlier, it becomes so relevant even today when we are going through this phase in our lives. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, so thank you, Shopnil. Thank you, Dr. Datto. Thank you, Momita, for all these speculations. And I would like to add that Shopnil had delivered really a very lucid and thought-provoking paper because it is so very relevant in these pandemic period, when we are every moment we are made to uh, made to realize the pangs of agony and pangs of death. So I think this is a very relevant paper for these days. Thank you, Shopnil, once again.
Thank you,
So
ma'am.
now I would like to pass on to the next speaker, Ritik Bag. He will be telling us on Hardy's tragic worldview in the Mayor of Canterbury. Yes, Ritik, please start.
Good evening, everyone. So, the paper I am presenting today is titled The Tragic Worldview of Thomas Hardy in The Mayor of Casterbridge. Thomas Hardy's worldview, as expressed in The Mayor of Casterbridge, has some parallels with the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, his approach towards life. Schopenhauer's philosophy holds that all nature, including man, is the expression of an insatiable will. It is through the will, the in itself of all existence, that humans find all their suffering. Desire for more is what causes this suffering. The concept of immanent will is very apparent throughout the text, as it somehow manages to disrupt the life of Henchard, almost as if a malevolent force is conspiring against the main character. In Darwin's On the Tendency of Species to Form Varieties and on the Perpetuation of Varieties and Species by Natural Selection, Darwin talks about the theory of natural selection. The species who are the fittest to survive are selected by nature to propagate further. In the text, scenarios such as the rapid industrialization of the rural society, humiliation of his own employee by Henchard himself, all point towards the implication of the Darwinian theory or the Marxist materialism. A case can be made pointing out that Hardy's approach towards the world around him was very contrasting to that of the high romantics such as Blake, Lord Byron, Wordsworth, or even Coleridge. In Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, text of 1834, he puts forth the idea that nature reflects human emotions. Nature is empathetic towards our species. He prayeth best who loveth best, all things both great and small, for the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all. Coleridge writes, there seems to be the idea existent in Coleridge's perception of life that God watches over us all. Here, nature, synonymous with God, is imposed with all things great as imagined by mankind. To do great deeds is to be loved by nature or God. Love is glorified as much as in any romantic text of the time. But Hardy suspends the idea of any superior power watching over us. He portrays the idea in his text that nature is in fact apathetic towards mankind. The role of Hap becomes crucial in his execution of the concept. It can be said that Hardy had a very anti romantic approach towards his craft. Although in his depiction of the landscapes he was very romantic, but the essence of his philosophy is not romantic at all. In a sense, Hardy comes off as being tragic, material, and Darwinian in his treatment of his material. These ideals are reflected in Henchard's apathy towards his employee when he humiliates him, or Henchard losing all his women to Farfrae, or Farfrae causing the downfall of Henchard's business. This also ties into the conflict between the haves and the have-nots, how capitalism eats away at the societal equilibrium at the cost of the people at the bottom of the hierarchy, the proletariats, almost like a cataclysm. Modernism seems to be a keystone in Hardy's depiction of the rural landscape of the society in the text. The import of machines, price of the grains playing a huge role, the displacement of capital, the logic of late capitalism all imply that Hardy was a modernist. Although it is clear that he was a fan of the old, a man deeply rooted in historical heritages and values, as shown through his protagonist Henchard. In Hegel's theory of dialectics, Hegel points out that unnerving conflict between thesis and antithesis. It seems that Hardy, in his text, has abided by the same principle depicting the conflict between Henchard and Farfrae. They stand for the complete opposite things, where Henchard is a man of stoic character, very stubborn and passionate in his core, but very nonchalant in his exterior. Farfrae is more of an impulsive and modern character. He can make friends easily, contrary to Henchard. He can charm people unlike Henchard, and most importantly, he can be very empathetic to people, which is extremely difficult for a character like Henchard. The tragedy in Hardy's art of writing reflects the themes of Greek tragedy. In an Aristotelian tragedy, the most important element is the experience of catharsis, the arousing of pity, and fear in the audience. The effect of catharsis on the audience depends on the unity of the plot and the effective presence of a tragic hero. The plot in an Aristotelian tragedy consists of the reversal, the recognition, and the final suffering. The protagonists following a pattern of decline and alienation. Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge is similar to the Greek tragedies, in particular Sophocles' Oedipus the King. Both literary works use three elements: catharsis, a complicated plot containing a secret, and the presence of a tragic hero, to create the effect of tragedy. In The Mayor of Casterbridge, however, Hardy uses these three characteristics to create a modern Aristotelian tragedy played out in mid-19th century England. In conclusion, Hardy's worldview cannot be really limited to terms such as pessimism or meliorism. A serious reader needs to re-evaluate Hardy's essence in terms of modernism, romanticism, alienation, and materialism. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dipti, for your thought-provoking paper. It's more of an observation than a question proper. Yes, it is indeed true that in the Mayor of Casterbridge, as we read it, since it was written in the end of the 1890s, Hardy must have quite clearly felt the damaging impact that reckless capitalism built on the power of the scheme, as it were wreaking havoc in most of the industrial towns of London. And in the Wessex novels, we do get hints, including in the Mayor of Casterbridge, that damage is well and truly percolating into the rural landscape of England as well, which actually turned out to be true within a couple of decades. So thank you for your paper. And if there are any questions or clarifications or comments from any other participants, please unmute yourself.
Ritik,
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
thank you for your very comprehensive, multi-angular approach to your topic. I would
Thank you,
like
sir.
to have just a small clarification on this, pursuant to your discussion. Why is immanent will, what is your opinion in this regard? Why is immanent will choosing the more primitive Henchard
Yeah.
as its target and sparing the more modern Farfrae? What is your understanding of this choice?
So here, immanent will can be represented as, or can be, looked through the perspective that immanent will is the nemesis to Henchard. And here I would like to quote Schopenhauer, that Schopenhauer said that we as human beings, the moment we get out of our mother's womb, we always have this incessant drive of will, which he called the will of life. So, but Schopenhauer's viewpoint towards the will of life is very much similar to Hardy in the sense that they both have a very tragic and borderline pessimistic attitude towards the will. So here Hardy has also depicted the immanent will as probably an instrument to the downfall of Henchard.
Yes, I agree with you. That is not my question at all. I want to
Oh, sorry.
know why has Immanent Will chosen the more primitive personage in this book, William Henchard, and sparing innocence, allowing Donald Farfrae to prosper, whereas Henchard is getting destroyed. If Immanent Will is really immanent, how has the choice come into force? If you have any idea of that.
I'm sorry, sir. I don't really have a perspective on this, but I will have to think on it.
Keep thinking. We will get your answer sometime later on. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Kuntalda. Thank you, Professor Datto. And thank you, Ritik. Waiting for some other observations or questions.
Shruti, before you continue, Dr. Rudrashis Dotto, your voice is coming in as very muffled at times. I think, I don't know, for everybody, perhaps it is a bit unclear. Could you please
Yes,
once...
we can't hear Dr. Dotto properly. That is a problem, indeed.
Okay, that may be a network issue from my end.
Might be,
at your
yes,
end.
but you were very clear in the beginning. Suddenly,
Ah.
it's become a bit muffled right now. Okay.
Thank you.
So, Ritik, thank you for your very, as Kuntalda has just pointed out, comparative and comprehensive tragic speculation, which is a reality in our life nowadays. Just as Shopnil has said about the mortality of life. So your papers are really reminders that any day will be no one in the world. So anyway, so I hope there are no more observations on this. So I will proceed on to the next speaker, Deboshmita Bhattacharya. She will be speaking on Sri Bankim Chandra's Matangini as a modern woman. Yes, please, Deboshmita, you may start.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Debsmita Bhattacharya. I am a student of English Department of Narsinga Dutt College under University of Calcutta. My paper title is Matangini as a Modern Woman. The character of Matangini is taken from Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's Rajmohan's wife. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay is known as the Emperor of Bengali literature. We call him Sahitya Samrat. He composed our national song Bande Mataram and countless novels and stories. His first novel, Rajmohan's Wife, written in English, was published periodically in the weekly newspaper Indian Field in the year 1864. The novel provides a detailed description of everyday activities and social manners of the East Bengal middle class life during the 19th century undivided Bengal. Matangini is not only the major character but also the female protagonist in Rajmohan's Wife. But Chattopadhyay is subtle in naming his novel Rajmohan's Wife, probably to highlight the dominance of patriarchy. The title ironically manifests domestic relation as an important construct of woman's identity in society. Matangini is in a state of a dejected marriage with Rajmohan, who has a criminal bent of mind. He can only invoke fear, dread, and contempt in her, and keeps her caged in the four walls of the house. In fact, she is even restricted in fetching water from outside without her husband's consent. At times, Matangini is found brooding over her childhood days when she could play with both boys and girls, as there were never any trammels and restrictions. All were free and she enjoyed her prerogative. But at present, her movement is restricted within the known four walls added with her husband barbarism. Yet she emerges as a fearless, courageous, and an undaunted woman. It is presumed that the author is poetry Matangini tries to draw our attention to the new image of unshackled womanhood, which is symbolic of a new nation in the making. Just as India as a nation became conscious, but at the time confident of its position under British rule, so also the women in colonial India became more assertive of their rights as the result of the Indian Renaissance that initiated in the early 19th century. And from this point of view, Matangini emerges as a modern woman. I would like to discuss two major incidents from the novel that highlights Matangini emerging as Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's modern woman. The novel in the discussion shows how women aspire for independence in the male-dominated society. The Chattopadhyay brings revolution in the conventional idea of a wife as a blind and sole supporter of her husband, irrespective of Matangini's husband's moral status, in review through the character of Matangini. The first instance occurs when Matangini overhears that her husband stay in robberies and his plan to raid and kill Madhav, her sister Hemangini's husband, and Ashraf Madhav's property by stealing the documents. Matangini makes an instant decision to rescue them without second thought to her own honor. For a woman, leaving her house without permission is considered as transgression. She ran through the shortest jungle way to her sister's home, facing all the possible threats in her way in order to warn them beforehand. In the jungle, the robbers get alerted by someone's footsteps and they started to follow the sound of the footsteps. By sheer use of common sense and mercurial wit, she saves herself from being caught. After running for some time, Matangini takes the nocturnal advantage and hides herself in pool's black water in the black of the night and covers her bright lily face with her long hairs. The robbers miserably fail to find the source while having a thought of some evil power. After reaching the house of Madhav, she alerts them about the robbery plans and advises them to secure their property papers. At the dead end of the night, when the robbers try to barge into Madhav's estate, all their attempts prove futile. As in the meantime, Madhav manages to prepare his lathials to counter their attack. Matangini has saved Madhav not only for her secret love, but also the righteousness that rules her character. For the time being, emotion overpowers them. They confess their hidden love to each other. But she has an inner strength to instantly control her emotion. They were respectful to their own love and at the same time, they were loyal to their married partners. Matangini takes her leave with her promise that she will never appear before him and bids him farewell with her words, "Fare you well, be you happy, Madhav, and be my hame happy with you." The second sequence of Matangini's prowess is measured while she remains captive under Mothur, another virulent opponent of Madhav. Mothur, the womanizer gripped by uncontrollable lust, captures and cages Matangini in his own mahal, and greed and power has also driven him to kidnap Madhav as well, and keep him in the same mahal. Throughout her captivity, Matangini has shown herself as a defiant and stubborn woman, through physically weak, being without food for days, but she never for a moment succumbs to Mothur's sexual aggression, and when she is ultimately rescued, she appears almost starved to death. The portrayal of Matangini is symbolic of the nation in the making, which is shaky but trying to get firm footing as things unravel to its advantage. Matangini embodies the vitality, glamour, and appeal of an emerging new India trying to break free of its social and cultural ills. And so the name becomes significant as it carries an extra weightage. According to Makarant R. Paranjape, Matangini is not just Rajmohan's wife, but the spirit or personification of modern India itself. He further observes, this is an emergent, hesitant, yet strong-willed and attractive India. The defined features of modern India are thus its energy and its adventurousness, its unwillingness to be confined by tradition, and its desire to break free. The restlessness, vitality, charm, and drive of an emerging society are thus embodied in Matangini. According to Pyarichand Mitra, Matangini's desired power increases, and her extreme moral sense painted her as a modern woman who has the strength of fight alone. It can be stated that the woman's body was the ultimate site of virtue, of stability, the last refuge of freedom. Through a steady process of regression, this independent selfhood had been folded back from the public domain to the interior space of the household, and then further pushed back into the hidden depths of an inviolate, chaste, pure female body. Matangini's rebellious soul is strong enough to eradicate the evils of society, and her personal ventures and trials can be set an example of an independent thinking. The concept of gender discrimination, gender inequality should be abolished as women have the full right to take their own decisions and no other can snatch it. Matungini's sense of righteousness and her spree to live with her head held high is very much relevant even today. That is all. Thank you for listening to me with patience.
Thank you, Devsmita, for your comments on Bunkim Chandra's Rajmohan's wife. I have just one specific question for you. I assume that you have read the novel. Do you believe the ending of the conclusion of the novel is somehow sudden or abrupt, or do you feel that the sequences of events that lead up to the conclusion of the novel is justified?
I think, sir, there perhaps the reason why novel has an abrupt ending where readers are informed that Matungini died early. In this context, I can refer Meenakshi Mukherjee's commented. According to her, abruptness and the imbalance of the ending may be the result of an anxiety such women of energy generated by posing and threat to the social order and creating a moral dilemma for the author.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, any other observations?
Yes, Shruti is there, and therefore I cannot restrain my temptation to ask one question. Although this question is primarily addressed to our paper reader, Devasmita, I would like to know from her, and if Shruti can supplement, Matangini in Bankim Chandra's Rajmohan's wife, can she be considered as the earliest example of the progress of the feminine self in Indian English fiction writing, especially as a predecessor to Bimola in Ghore Baire? This might be a bit difficult question for Devasmita, but still, if Devasmita initiates and if Shruti supplements, that will be my great expectation, if you say.
Sir, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's Rajmohan's wife is he wrote it in 1864, and Rabindranath Tagore wrote Bimola Ghore Baire, and from these books Ghore and Baire, Bimola's character is written at 1816 around. I think this is, but Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's this novel was not published, was not fully published in before of this Ghore and Baire. So I can say that obviously this Matangini's character of this Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's Rajmohan's wife is written before this Ghore and Baire's Bimola's character, but it was not published then. So I can say that Bimola's character from Ghore and Baire was the first feminist novel from Rabindranath Tagore. That's all.
Actually, Kuntalba, the idea of feminist enlightenment was itself in the air in the 19th century. Women and education, women enlightenment, Vidyasagar was coming in. Rabindranath Tagore, his family was also very enlightened. So it is not difficult to think of the female figure as a harbinger of freedom. If you think of Swarnamoyi Devi, she was enlightened. Okay, so this kind of enlightenment, that this freedom. So freedom was what should I say? This was a source of enlightenment, and again, enlightenment was coming in. So the female figure was itself from the 19th century in various novels. It was being projected as a figure of enlightenment, of illumination, of freedom, etc.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very
Principal
much.
Madam
We will-
has
we will
raised
talk
a
about it.
hand. Principal
Yes,
Madam
madam.
has raised a hand.
Yes, madam.
Sorry. I didn't want to raise my hand. It was a mistake.
Okay, madam.
Yes, any other observations?
আমি একটু বলবো
হ্যাঁ, বল।
রাজবোন ওয়াইফস নিয়ে আলোচনা শুনলাম।
হুম।
মাতঙ্গিনী, as per my knowledge is concerned, মাতঙ্গিনী কোনো উইম্যানহুডের আইকন বলে আমার মনে হয় না, এবং বঙ্কিমচন্দ্র এমন কোনো নারী চরিত্র সৃষ্টি করেননি যেখানে মেয়েদেরকে আজকের যুগের প্রেক্ষিতে একেবারে একজন ইন্ডিভিজুয়ালিস্ট ওম্যান হিসেবে তিনি দাঁড় করাতে পারেন। প্রফেসর কুন্তল দা খুব সুন্দর একটা কোয়েশ্চেন তুলেছেন যে তার সঙ্গে ঘরে বাইরের বিমলার একটা কোনো রিলেশন তৈরি করা যায় কিনা। বিমলাও কিন্তু সেই অর্থে ঘরে বাইরে উপন্যাসের যে প্রেক্ষাপটটা, পটভূমিকাটা, সেটা কিন্তু ঠিক কোনো নারীকে এককভাবে দেখানোর কোনো প্রয়াস আমার ধারণা সেখানে ছিল না। সেখানে একটা বড় বৃহত্তর রাজনৈতিক চালচিত্রের প্রেক্ষাপটে একজন পুরুষ কিভাবে তার মানুষ রমণীকে, মানুষ তনয়াকে তিনি তৈরি করছেন বা কিভাবে দেখতে চাইছেন, এবং সে স্বামী এবং যে কোনো পুরুষ অভিভাবক নিরপেক্ষ একজন নারী, ঠিক এইভাবে তিনি দেখতে চাইছেন, কিন্তু দেখতে কিন্তু চাইছেন একজন পুরুষই। সেই পুরুষ কিন্তু নিখিলেশ, এবং সেই জন্য সে বিমলাকে একটা পরীক্ষার মুখে ঠেলে দিচ্ছে, এবং এই পরীক্ষার মধ্যে খুব সঙ্গতভাবে বিমলা কিন্তু সেই পরীক্ষায় পাশ করতে পারছে না। অনুত্তীর্ণ বিমলাকে ফিরে আসতে হচ্ছে, এবং সে সন্দীপ আর নিখিলেশ এই দুয়ের প্রেমের গভীরতাকে সে বুঝতে পারছে না। যখন বুঝতে পারলো নিখিলেশের প্রেমের গভীরতা, তখন কিন্তু জীবনের যা সর্বনাশ হওয়ার সেটা হয়ে গেছে। এইভাবে একটা নারী চরিত্র যখন দাঁড় করানো হলো, তার সঙ্গে কিন্তু ওই মাতঙ্গিনীর ক্যারেক্টারের কোনো তুলনাই চলে না। প্রথমত বঙ্কিমচন্দ্র এই উপন্যাস লিখেছিলেন একদম প্রথমে 1865-তে বঙ্কিমচন্দ্র দুর্গেশ নন্দিনী লেখেন। 1864-তে ইংরেজিতে লেখা তার উপন্যাস। একজন আদ্যন্ত একজন কলোনিয়াল লোক, ঔপনিবেশিক একজন মনীষী বলা যেতে পারে, এবং শ্রুতি যেটা বলছিল যে নবজাগরণের একটা প্রেক্ষাপট 19 শতক, সেই সময়কার একজন চিন্তক, সেই সময়কার একজন ভাবুক বঙ্কিমচন্দ্র, তিনি প্রথমে সাহিত্য রচনা করার জন্য একজন সরকারি উচ্চপদস্থ কর্মী, তিনি ঔপনিবেশিক ভারতবর্ষে তিনি সাহিত্যের কলম তুলে নিয়েছেন, এবং অবভিয়াসলি তিনি ইংরেজিতে সেটা রচনা করছেন। এবং ইংরেজিতে লিখতে গিয়ে তখন কিন্তু যেটা হয়েছিল সেটা হচ্ছে একটা ন্যাশনালিজমের একটা হাওয়া তৈরি হয়েছিল, এবং সেই ন্যাশনালিস্ট যে এনভায়রনমেন্ট, তার মধ্যে কিন্তু তিনি নারীকে সেইভাবে দেখতে চেয়েছেন, যেটা আমরা পরবর্তীকালে আনন্দমঠে দেখতে পাচ্ছি। এই যে ন্যাশনালিজমের যে জায়গা থেকে একটা ভারতবর্ষের ভারত মাতা বলে তাকে বর্ণনা করা, ভারত মাতার মায়ের মতো ভাবে তাকে দেখা, দেশকে দেশমাতৃকাকে আজকেও আমরা মায়ের মতো দেখতে চাই, কিন্তু সেখানে রবীন্দ্রনাথে এসে ব্যাপারটা খুব একটা তার যে গণ্ডি, তার যে নির্ধারিত সীমা, সেটা ছাড়িয়ে যায়, সেটা কিন্তু ন্যাশনালিজম থেকে ইন্টারন্যাশনালিজমে চলে যায়। বঙ্কিমচন্দ্র কিন্তু কখনোই ওই ন্যাশনালিজমের যে গণ্ডি, সেই গণ্ডি ছাড়িয়ে ইন্টারন্যাশনালিজমে যেতে পারেননি, যেটা কিন্তু রবীন্দ্রনাথের পক্ষে সম্ভব হয়েছিল যাওয়া। তো যাই হোক, মানে বঙ্কিমের এই অন্যান্য সমস্ত উপন্যাস নিয়ে আলোচনা হয়, কিন্তু ইংরেজি বিভাগ যে একটি মেয়ে দেবস্মিতা, তুমি সুন্দর করে রাজমোহন ওয়াইফ নিয়ে আলোচনা করলে, তুমি এটা পড়েছো এবং কিছু একটা ভেবেছো, এই জন্য তোমায় অনেক অভিনন্দন। আর আমি আমার বক্তব্য প্রকাশ করলাম এবং আমাকে এখানে আহ্বান করা হয়েছে, আমাকে একটা বলার সুযোগ দেওয়া হয়েছে বলে আমি সবাইকে আমার আন্তরিক অভিনন্দন জানাচ্ছি।
থ্যাংক ইউ ম্যাম।
এই প্রসঙ্গে একটু শ্রুতিকে বলে রাখি, কারণ শ্রুতি তো রাজমোহন সোয়াই পড়ায়। এটা আমার নিজের একটা জিজ্ঞাসা, পরে কথা বলবো, যে বঙ্কিমচন্দ্র এরকম একটা লেখা ইংরেজ আমলে লিখছেন, ইংরেজিতে লিখছেন, যেটা লিখলে সহজে ইংরেজদের নজরে পড়বেন তিনি। বাংলা লেখা হয়তো ইংরেজরা পড়তে বা জানতে বা বুঝতে একটু সময় নেবে। সেই উপন্যাস এই মাতঙ্গিনী নারী মুক্তির প্রতীক হয়ে দেখা দেবে। বঙ্কিমচন্দ্রের মানসিক গঠন বা রাজনৈতিক যে পরিবেশের মধ্যে বঙ্কিমচন্দ্র পরবর্তীকালে লেখাগুলোকে উপস্থাপনা করেছেন, তার সঙ্গে কি এটাকে খুব সঙ্গতিপূর্ণ বলে মনে হয়? যে প্রশ্নটা বর্ণালী তুলতে চেয়েছে, পরে এক সময় জানবো।
আচ্ছা কুন্তলদা, তবে বর্ণালী, হ্যাঁ, বর্ণালী দিও খুব সুন্দর একটা প্রসঙ্গ তুলেছেন। সেই ব্যাপারটা আমি বর্ণালীদির কাছ থেকেও জানতে চাইবো একটুখানি সময়ের জন্য, কারণ সব সময় সুযোগ মেলে না। তো বর্ণালীদি যখন বললেন স্বাধীনতার প্রতীক হিসেবে এখানে ইন্টারন্যাশনালিজমের একটা ভাবনা আসছে, বর্ণালীদি তুমি যদি এই প্রসঙ্গে একটু আনন্দময়ী চরিত্রটা বিশ্লেষণ করো তাহলে খুব ভালো লাগবে, একটু শুনতে চাই।
এই প্ল্যাটফর্মে প্রিন্সিপাল ম্যাডামও আছেন, আমি তারও একটু অ্যাটেনশন ড্র করছি। এখান থেকে একটা প্রস্তাব রাখলাম, যদি পরবর্তীতে করা যায়, ইংরেজি বাংলা দুটো ডিপার্টমেন্ট নিয়ে একটা কম্পারেটিভ লেভেলে কোনো সেমিনার এইভাবেই আমরা করতে পারি কিনা, এরকম কোনো একটা বিষয়কে নিয়ে খুব দরকার আমার মনে হয়।
এখানে পরে আমি ম্যাডাম,
আচ্ছা, থ্যাংক ইউ ভেরি মাচ।
থ্যাংক ইউ ম্যাডাম। বর্ণালীদি একটু তোমার কাছে শুনবো।
হ্যাঁ, আমি তোমাদের এই অনেকেই কথা বলবেন, আমার মনে হচ্ছে আমি খুব ছোট করে একটু বলি। আনন্দময়ী মানে গোরার চরিত্র, গোরার একটি অত্যন্ত উল্লেখযোগ্য চরিত্র আনন্দময়ী, এবং এই আনন্দময়ীর মধ্যে দিয়ে একটা খুব বড় ফিমেল আইকন যে রবীন্দ্রনাথ তুলে ধরতে চেয়েছিলেন, সেখানেই কিন্তু একটা ইন্টারন্যাশনালিজমের তার একটা বলা যেতে পারে তার একটা ঘোষণা হতে পারে। আনন্দময়ীকে ঘিরে শুধু ইন্টারন্যাশনালিজম নয়, আজকে বিশেষ করে সাম্প্রদায়িক সম্প্রীতির জায়গা, বর্ণ, ধর্ম, জাত সবকিছু নির্বিশেষে মানুষ পরিচয়ের যে একটা ঔদার্য, যেখানে রবীন্দ্রনাথ একদম একেবারে তার যখন যবে থেকে তার ঔপনিষদিক জ্ঞান হয়েছিল, প্রজ্ঞা হয়েছিল, যবে থেকে উনি মহর্ষির কাছ থেকে ঔপনিষদিক দীক্ষাগুলো নিয়েছিলেন, এবং যখন তার মনে হয়েছিল ঠিক একইভাবে দাদু, নানক, কবির, জোলা বা ওই পৃথিবীর সমস্ত লালন, এদের মতো দার্শনিকদের যে মনুষ্যত্বের যে বোধ, মানবিকতার যে উদার মানবিকতার যে বোধ, সেই উদার মানবিকতার বোধে কিন্তু যেহেতু তাদের ব্রাহ্ম পরিবার, ব্রাহ্ম সমাজের সঙ্গে তাদের যোগাযোগ, এবং বিভিন্ন জায়গায় মহর্ষি গোটা ভারতবর্ষ জুড়ে এবং ভারতের বাইরেও ব্রাহ্ম সমাজকে ছড়িয়ে দেওয়ার জন্য এক ধরনের বলা যেতে পারে ব্রাহ্ম আন্দোলনে নেমেছিলেন। সেখান থেকে ছোটবেলা থেকেই কিন্তু রবীন্দ্রনাথের সঙ্গে এই ব্রাহ্ম সমাজ এবং ব্রহ্ম যে উপলব্ধি, তার একটা ঘনিষ্ঠ যোগাযোগ হয়েছিল, এবং সেখানে কিন্তু অপৌত্তলিকতা এবং উদার মানবতাবাদ এই দুটো বিষয় ভীষণভাবে তাকে আন্দোলিত করেছিল এবং ভীষণভাবে তাকে প্রভাবিত করেছিল। যে জায়গা থেকে দাঁড়িয়ে কিন্তু পরবর্তীকালে, যেটা আমরা গোরার প্রসঙ্গ তুল্য বলি, আমি বলছি রবীন্দ্রনাথের অন্যান্য যে নারী চরিত্র, একবার বোধহয় শ্রুতি স্বর্ণকুমারী দেবীর কথা বলেছিল, ভুল করে স্বর্ণময়ী বলে ফেলেছিল, স্বর্ণকুমারী দেবী,
স্বর্ণকুমারী
দিদি, হ্যাঁ, রবীন্দ্রনাথের দিদি স্বর্ণকুমারী দেবী, তিনি
জ্যেষ্ঠ কন্যা দেবেন্দ্রনাথের,
হ্যালো
বোধহয় দেবেন্দ্রনাথের সবচেয়ে বড় মেয়ে, জ্যেষ্ঠ,
হ্যাঁ, রবীন্দ্রনাথের দিদি, বড় দিদি, হ্যাঁ। তো এই স্বর্ণকুমারী দেবী অনেক বেশি বয়সে বিয়ে করেছিলেন, এবং স্বর্ণকুমারী দেবী ভারতী পত্রিকা সম্পাদনা শুরু করেছিলেন, এবং সেই সময়কার সত্যি মানে একটা মহিলা আইকন তিনি। হ্যাঁ, সেই জায়গা থেকে, এবং রবীন্দ্রনাথ যে নারী চরিত্র সৃষ্টি করেছিলেন, বিভিন্ন গল্প, বিভিন্ন কবিতা, বিভিন্ন উপন্যাস, সব জায়গাতেই দেখতে পাই যে মেয়েদের প্রতি তার একটা গভীর শ্রদ্ধা ছিল। তার কারণ তিনি খুব মানে যে সমস্ত মেয়েদের সবসময় দেখতেন, তারা প্রত্যেকেই খুব বলা যেতে পারে খুবই শিক্ষিতা, খুব মেধাবিনী, প্রত্যেকেই খুব স্মার্ট, হ্যাঁ, সব প্রতিভা প্রত্যেকের মধ্যে রয়েছে, এরকম তিনি ঠিক মানে বাঙালি লজ্জাশীলা নারীদের দেখতে খুব একটা মানে অভ্যস্ত ছিলেন না, যে কারণে তিনি তার যে নারী চরিত্রটা তার প্রত্যেকেই খুব আধুনিকা, এবং প্রত্যেকে আধুনিকা শুধু নয়, সেই সঙ্গে শিক্ষিত, বিদগ্ধ এবং খুব সামাজিকভাবে মনের দিক থেকে খুব উদার প্রত্যেকে। এবং এই যে নারী চরিত্র, তার মধ্যে গোড়া চরিত্রে যে আনন্দময়ী, সেই আনন্দময়ী তার মধ্যে আরেকটা আলাদা ডাইমেনশন রয়েছে। সেই ডাইমেনশনটার মধ্যে তিনি গোটা ভারতবর্ষকে দেখতে চেয়েছিলেন এবং খুব বড় বৃহৎ অর্থে গোটা পৃথিবীর যে বিশ্ব নাগরিকতা, সেই নাগরিকতার জায়গাটাকে দেখতে চেয়েছেন। কারণ এই গোড়া বলে মানে একদম নাম দিয়ে যে উপন্যাসটা দেখছি, এটা 1912, 1914, 1916 সালে সম্ভবত লেখা। এই উপন্যাসে উপন্যাসে যে প্রথম যে গোরার সঙ্গে আমাদের আলাপ হচ্ছে, সেই গোরা কিন্তু ভীষণভাবে সে ব্রাহ্মণ্যবাদী এবং সে ভীষণভাবে সে আচার বিচার মেনটেন করে চলে এবং কোনো অব্রাহ্মণের মহল্লায় সে যায় না ভীষণভাবে, কিন্তু সে ভীষণ দরদি, ভীষণ পরোপকারী, এরকম একটা অদ্ভুত একটা মানে দ্বৈরথ কিন্তু তার মধ্যে রয়েছে। এবং তার বন্ধু বিনয় তাকে এই আচার সংস্কার থেকে বার করে আনার কথা বলে, কিন্তু তার গোরার সেই একটা অদ্ভুত গোয়ার তুমি সেই কখনোই সেই জায়গা থেকে যাবে না, অথচ সে মানুষকে ভীষণ ভালোবাসে। সবকিছু আচার অনুষ্ঠান পালন করেও, ব্রাহ্মণ্যবাদের যে চিরাচরিত যে নিয়ম, সেই নিয়ম কানুন পালন করেও সে কিন্তু মানুষকে ভালোবাসে। এবং মানুষকে ভালোবাসতে গিয়ে দেখলাম যে একটা সময় তার কিন্তু চিত্তের জাগরণ ঘটলো, এবং চিত্তের জাগরণ ঘটলো যখন, তখন সে তার জন্মরহস্য যখন জানতে পারলো, তখন জন্মরহস্য জানতে পারার পরে তার দেখলো যে আনন্দময়ী তার মা, কিন্তু আনন্দময়ী আসলে তার কেউই নয়। আনন্দময়ী আসলে তার জন্মদাত্রী মাও না, আসলে আনন্দময়ী তার কেউই নয়। সে একজন খ্রিস্টান বালক এবং তাকে খুব ছোট্টবেলাকে তাকে এনে মানুষ করা হয়েছিল। আনন্দময়ীকে কিন্তু সে মা বলে চিরকাল সম্বোধন করে এসেছে। এবং এই যে জায়গা, এই জায়গা থেকেই কিন্তু রবীন্দ্রনাথের আনন্দময়ী বা আমাদের রাজমোহন ওয়াইফের মাতঙ্গিনীর এর ডাইমেনশন কিন্তু অনেক বড় হয়ে যায়, অনেক বড় হয়ে যায়। এবং আনন্দময়ীর ক্ষেত্রে যেটা বলা হচ্ছে, সেটা যেটা একটা মাদার আইকন, এবং সেটা কিন্তু অবনীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুর যে দেশমাতার আইকন ছবি এঁকেছিলেন, তার সঙ্গে কিন্তু এটার কোনো সম্পর্ক নেই। এবং সেটা কিন্তু একটা ভৌগোলিক গণ্ডির মধ্যে সীমাবদ্ধ হয়ে যায়। সেটা কিন্তু ভাবনা চিন্তা সবকিছুই একটা আর্যায়িত ধর্মের মধ্যে, আর্যায়নের মধ্যে আটকে যায়। কিন্তু যে আনন্দময়ীকে রবীন্দ্রনাথ এঁকেছেন, সেই আনন্দময়ী কিন্তু কোনো ভূগোলের পরিসীমার মধ্যে, গণ্ডির মধ্যে থেকে আবদ্ধ করা যায় না। সেখানে কিন্তু নিখিল বিশ্ব ব্রহ্মাণ্ড এবং নিখিল মানব, যেখানে জাত নেই, কুল নেই, ধর্ম নেই, যেখানে মানুষের সঙ্গে মানুষের যে তফাৎটা মানুষ করে, সে কোনো তফাৎ নেই, সেরকম একটা মাতৃমূর্তিকে আমরা দেখতে পাই, যিনি স্নেহময়ী, আনন্দময়ী। এইটাই আমি মানে খুব ছোট করে এইটুকু বললাম, পরে ভাবনা চিন্তা করে বড় বলা যেতে পারে। শ্রুতিকে ধন্যবাদ আমাকে এই সুযোগটা দেওয়ার।
থ্যাংক ইউ বর্ণালীদি, অনেক তোমার কাছ থেকে অনেক চিন্তা ভাবনার রসদ পেলাম, কুন্তল দাও বললেন। এবং
শ্রুতি আমি একটু তোমায় ইন্টারাপ্ট করি। আই থিংক রাজমোহনস ওয়াইফ ইজ নট টট বাই ইউ। ঠিক বলছি? হ্যাঁ, বিকজ ইউ হ্যাভ দাত্তানি। আই থিংক রাজমোহনস ওয়াইফ ইজ টট বাই পূর্ণিমা ম্যাডাম।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ। তবে এই সমস্ত আলোচনাগুলা আমাদের সেমিনারের সাফল্য এখানেই, যে এই সমস্ত আলোচনাটা আস্তে আস্তে আমাদের শেষ পেপারটা শোনার জন্য আমাদের তৈরি করে দিচ্ছে। And we shall now proceed to the last paper, which is a very relevant paper, because we are discussing the same context. Arnima Manna, The Others, in Dattani's play Bravely for the Queen. Yes, Arnima, please start.
Good evening, everybody. I am Arnima Manna, student of semester 2, and my topic is The Others in Dattani's play Bravely for the Queen. Mahesh Dattani is the first Indian playwright writing in English to be awarded Sahitya Academy Award for his contribution to drama got in 1958. Indian English drama has found a new life in the work of Dattani, who chooses to work on untrodden paths like patriarchal society, female oppression, gender segregation, etc. are outstanding. He is a writer, director as well as playwright who lays emphasis on women and its different faces in his play Bravely Fought the Queen, first staged in 1991. The story describes the callous private lives of the two sisters married to two brothers. The play Bravely Fought the Queen is written from a completely feminist angle. The word feminism originated from French word feminisme in the 19th century. It soon started signifying a political stance of someone committed to changing the social position of women. Since then, the term has taken on the sense of one who believes that women are subjugated because of their sex and that women deserve at least formal equality in the eyes of the law. Bravely Fought the Queen is a play where Dattani reveals all the facts what patriarchal domination, female oppression, and feminism very clearly, and I want to present a paper on this topic. Bravely Fought the Queen is one such a play that makes us think critically. The play is classified in three acts titled Women, Men, and Free for All. The Act 1 exposes the female world marked by claustrophobic spaces. Second act is male world of business, and in the third act, both the world are exposed in the background of family setting. The play aims at tearing the veil of filthy realities and gruesome truths. Those lie behind the presence of conservative Indian morality. Besides the issues of gender and sexual identity, Dattani also exhibits his concern for sexual abuse, adultery, homosexualities, social rigidity, and feminine consciousness. The play is set around an Indian joint family in which the male authority is represented by two sons, Jiten and Nitin, and the claustrophobia of domesticity and confined is apparent through their wives Dolly and Alka, and they are tortured by their mother-in-law Ba, the matriarch, and as well as their husbands. As for their domestic violence, Dolly gives birth of a spastic child Daksha, which is very pathetic in today's society. The play opens with a world of women in which Lalita arrives as an intruder and becomes a medium for us to have a peep into the lives of Alka and Dali with their own little arguments which they reveal to Lalita. When the play opens, Dali is getting ready to go out for a party, but the party has been cancelled. Lalita's conversation with Dali and Alka generates subtle hints about their lives, such as Dali's affair with the cook and the secret of her spastic child, Daksha. Lalita tries to discuss with them a masked ball arranged by the men, their husbands. It appears as if the men are trying to intrude the women's spaces by sending an interloper in the form of Lalita. Then there is Ba, who by her frequent instructions disrupts the evolving intimacy between the three men. Lalita, who begins as an intruder, slowly merges into the world of the woman when she reveals her own emptiness and purposelessness and her obsession with the bonsai, which she tries to confront it. She immediately bonds with Dolly, who escapes her bedroom by imagining an adulterous union with the young cook Kanhaya, and it is therefore escape that everyone wants. Alka by droning at everything in alcohol, Dolly on the wings of fantasy, and Lalita through her obsession with the bonsai. Here, the bonsai is a recurrent metaphor in the play. As Chaudhuri points out, the stunt growth, the bizarre shape, the grotesque reality of the bonsai becomes resonant in the existence of all the characters in the play. Another character, Jiten, is driven to tears near the end of the play when Dolly reminds him that Daksha is a spastic child, is a result of his violence on her, and his brother Nitin tries to continue a loveless relationship with his wife Alga, a screen behind which he seeks his clandestine queer relationships. Another character, Ba, has been a victim of patriarchal discourses and tries to oppress her daughters in law by instigating her sons to use the violence against them. Alka, probably the weakest female character, is victimized by her own brother Praful. So the play is a dramatic representation of the emptiness and shame in the lives of cloistered women, self-indulgent, unscrupulous men, lost in the web of terrible secrets, deception, and hypocrisy. To conclude this, one has to say that Dattani makes a handy thought for his play. The unique themes, psychology of the characters, male and female position, which are masterly handled in his works. Moreover, the presentation of Indian society, the rigidity of tradition ideology, the biasness of physical appearance, and the female consciousness are perfectly managed through his pen. He confessed that his female characters are not victims but their own repression. This has serious consequences on the lives of women. And here Dolly is only character who not only stands up for herself but also supports Alka when everyone is bent on torturing her. So, for instance, domination could be one form of power that eventually manifests in every walk of life and seeks legitimacy. Dolly has created a space even in her subjectivity, and this space manifests itself in the form of fantasies in which a subject may take her destiny in her own hands. So it is Dolly who deserves the title of the brave queen as she fights for her cause vehemently with all her might. It is all for my observation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Arnima, for your commentary on Dattani's Bravely for the Queen. I assume that you have read the text, and having read the text, I would just ask you to comment or to throw some light on what you think about the characteristic multi-level stages which Dattani very often employed to great effect, including in this particular play. The multi-level stages. Your commentary, your comment and thoughts on the multi-level stages which Dattani employed in his plays, specifically in Bravely for the Queen.
Yes, sir. I think that in Dattani's play, female characters suffer not because they are sinners, but because of the men whom they believed and submitted themselves and their life in their hands. And Dattani reveals the female's position in through this play. And till now, female has been seen as a product in our Orthodox society. So Dattani tries to confront it.
Okay, and the second one is what do you think about the character of Ba, which Dattani portrays in this particular play? I mean, what role has Ba to do in the entire transactional spaces, as it were, that takes place in the play?
Yes, sir. Ba is here presented through Dattani's pen. Ba is a Ba is mother-in-law of Jiten and mother-in-law of her Jiten's wife Dolly and Alka, and mother of Jiten and Nitin. And she is represented as a matriarch, matriarch in the past society, and here past, present, and future are dominated by our patriarch constantly.
Okay.
By the representative of past society, and she dominates present as she dominated by her husband, and then future and the result of future is Dolly gives birth a spastic child Daksha.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Arnima.
Thank you, Dr. Datta, and thank you, Arnima. This was the last paper, and it has the two last papers are so relevant for each and every day. Where when you open the TV, reports come how women are molested, how they are victimized, how they are made naked and tortured. So all these papers, I think, especially the two, and even before that, the two previous papers, uh, taking us back into the memories of mortality, and also the first paper that was also very relevant, and the last two, they are remembering, we are reminded each and every moment when we are talking about women's empowerment. Even then, the fate of Matungini and the fate of Dolly and Alka, they are reminding us of how every day, every moment, women are commodified and tortured. In behalf of the Department of English, I would like to request Principal Madam, because I know her research area is women empowerment, if she just very briefly, if she can put in one or two words in this respect, we will be very grateful to her. Please, Madam.
No, actually, my research of women empowerment has got no relationship with English literature actually. But still, if I'm requested to say something, actually, women empowerment is not a new thing. Women empowerment, what we are thinking today, it was in our society from ancient period. And if we really go through different books and different phrases written over in different religious books and religious statements, and even some religious or rather socio-religious thoughts, we can see that empowerment was there, but somehow it was misconceived, or it was our practice which make it to some extent important today, that we today we think that we need to be empowered. Actually, we were empowered, and we were not only empowered, actually in our society female part is was running equivalently with the male, and female liberty was not a women liberty is not a new thing. If we can search over our historic things also, or historic writing also, we were enough empowered. But empowerment today, our conception of empowerment is a bit different. So I think whatever be the concept is, I don't think that empowerment is much more needed. Actually, what is needed is we should go through some equivalent way, and our thought should be equivalent, and there should not be any gender bias. And even in case of our future generation, they should think it in that way, that gender is not an issue. Actually, we have got opportunities, and we are getting privileges. So we should not think about any kind of gender discrimination. We should come forward, we should go, and our windows should be open with that eye, that we want to know, or we want to create something new where there is no gender bias at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam, for your very speculative thoughts. If anyone comes up with other observations, please.
May I ask a question?
Definitely, Shokni.
Actually, since you have talked about Bravely for the Queen and the Tanis, I have one small query. If possible, you can answer. You see, Dolly and Alka, although they have a contrasting attitude actually to this particular drama, because Dolly is a very impulsive character, whereas Alka, although she protests at the very end, but somewhere she is not as great, as impulsive as Dolly. So how do you explain this contradiction? I mean, these two characters. How can you separate these two characters?
Arnima, have you heard Shopnil's question?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, please answer.
Here, Dolly is only character who not only stands up for herself but also supports Alka when everyone is bent on torturing her. Actually, Dolly is মানে achieved the মানে queen as a মানে achieved the title of brave queen, and she supports Alka in all time, and she tries to Alka to protest about মানে against the male domination.
Yes, Shopti, have you got your answer?
Okay.
Yes, any other observations or questions about the whole?
Again, I would like to know from Shruti, who is the queen in this play who really fought very bravely?
Actually,
Is it Dolly Trivedi?
Right. Kuntal,
Is really anyone in the play who ultimately had fought very bravely?
Actually,
or is the title more a kind of a misnomer? In order to draw our attention, the title is there, but I don't find at the end of the play no real fight going on.
Exactly, Kuntalda, what you have said just now. The title is a kind of symbol of the female fight against the patriarchal aggression. Actually, the plays was modeled on Jhansi Ki Rani. Now, Dolly somehow puts up a protest against her husband, but Alka is an escapist. But you are right in pointing out that there is no real protest or aggression which has been shown, that is a woman walking out just as Nora is slamming the door against Towel's face. Nothing like that. But as you have rightly pointed out, the title foreshadows or anticipates a kind of positive attitude that yes, woman can rebel, woman can speak out. So this is a kind of positive mindedness for woman, attitude for woman.
Yes, I find the title is a bit feminist romanticization of the so-called fight. In my view, the title is rather to catch our sight, to draw us to some kind of an agenda, but
Yes.
in the play itself, there is not much of a real fight put up by the women.
Yes, actually, we have a kind of gender opposition in again, if you see dance like a man. Now, dancing is not an activity particularly meant for men. Again, bravely fought the queen. So this is, as you have rightly pointed out, Kundalda, this is a kind of stance on the part of Mahesh Dattani to jerk the audience out of their complacence. That look how the women are suffering.
If I may add, Shruti, I have read it quite a long time back. But when at the last stage of the play, when Dolly breaks into that spasmodic dance kind of movements,
yes,
that Daksha sort of copying the movements that Daksha makes as her exercise movements as a spastic child, I think there is a breakdown in Jiten. Jiten does react to that. There is a kind of a remorse in Jiten at that point, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly. So as Kuntalda was pointing out, I was just thinking that maybe at that moment where Jiten is made to feel responsible for the situation that his family is in, where he sort of an acknowledgement on his part as well that yes, I am responsible for it. Perhaps that is where Dolly is victorious. I mean, that is where Dolly sort of rides over that barrier that makes her a victim all the time, and she's able to make Jiten realize that he's not really a proper, in that sense, proper family man, father, husband, whatever. So he's responsible for Daksha's situation, and he should be taking responsibility for it rather than torturing the others. So that is a kind of a victory, I think, that she does score in
Right.
the end. So maybe I would call her, yes, she did fight bravely over there. So that is
Actually,
I was thinking that way, actually.
yes, she
But
could
again,
insult.
I will tell you, if you go further towards the conclusion of the play, if you
Yes,
think
yes.
of Nitin,
Yes, Nitin doesn't show.
goes to Alka when Alka is sleeping on the couch, and Alka, he says some words which are not very boosting, definitely, for Alka or
Yes.
purpose of feminism of any kind.
Yes.
And then Nitin goes back, presumably, to his homosexual partner.
Yes, exactly. For Nitin,
So the
yes.
conclusion is again undercutting that victory.
Exactly. So there are two parts. I mean, they're going parallelly. One is trying to show the way a woman can fight, and the other is returning to the status quo. So there is a kind of a conflict where we don't really know whether the entire female caste is victorious or not, because Alka doesn't have, and as Swapnil was saying, he's impulsive.
If we are looking forward to the liberation of women, Alka should also be liberated.
Yes, but she isn't. So maybe the liberation is incomplete.
We can't be satisfied with
Yes.
any liberation agenda
Right.
where only one of these women may be liberated and the others shall remain confined.
Yeah, maybe Dattani is just telling us that the process is very new, it is going on. So maybe
If Dattani is suggesting that not all women can be liberated, then I will not agree with him.
No, I think Datyani suggests that whoever be victorious, the show must go on.
Right.
Paradoxically, the show is going on.
Yes.
Okay, any other observations? Thank you so much.
if
to all
Dr.
our
Muglashi
paper-
Dotto can say anything, does Dr. Dotto have anything
Yes.
to add? Because we have been speaking a lot.
Actually, so far as this play is concerned, I believe somehow, as Professor Kuntol Chattopadhyay was rightly telling, when I was reading the play to teach it to my students, after the first reading, I was a bit perplexed as to where is the fight that is going on in the play. Then I presumably explained myself that the fight may not be in absolute physical terms or even semi-physical terms. It may be even in the context of psychological warfare of sorts. And a couple of interpretations of the Dattani's play at that point in time. I'm talking of the first decade of the, at 2010 or around that time. Most of the interpretations of this particular play or commentary on this particular play were somehow engineered, as it were, to rescue the Dattani from some form of a stasis, as it were, with regard to the plot at some point in time. I mean, there are points in the play where I felt that maybe is he losing the focus, if I may call it. If he had an agenda at all, has he lost focus of the agenda? But somehow or the other, well, this often happens in literature, that a play or a poem is written to tease, as it were, audiences, or to tease readers into generating meanings. But in this particular play, I still believe that any attempts at generating meaning out of the context as a definitive feminist text is perhaps a bit misplaced. I may be in a minority, but I genuinely believe that, well, when we tell that this play is essentially a feminist text at some level, we are imposing more than maybe perhaps the text can carry. But this is, of course, not to take away Dattani's credit in putting into sharp focus an issue that was hardly present in the English, the Indian stage, with regard to playwriting in the English medium, as it were. but he definitely deserves credit for it. And I believe if you are to read Dattani's explanations today, he might have, if given a fictional opportunity, he might have rewritten the play by making some changes, as it were, or bringing in issues and omitting certain sections, perhaps to make it more focused or powerful. Yes, that is all that I was thinking all along when I was hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Datta.
Yeah.
And I hope all these observations our students are hearing, and I hope they will be very much grateful for what they have received from all these discussions, because in class, you know, they have a routine lecture, but all these observations, speculations from different ends, that sounds very useful to them. So I will hand over the mic again to Professor Dey. Yes, thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shruti. So we have come to the end of our program today, and I would like to invite Shubhashish Chattopadhyay, Professor Shubhashish Chattopadhyay, to deliver the vote of thanks.
I heard all of you. Thank you so much. And, you know, I could have finished it if this were creative, if I slightly misreading Shakespeare, if I shadows have offended, think but this and all is bended. But thanks, vote of thanks are not given like that. So I have to read it very specifically. I thank our principal ma'am for encouraging us to hold this webinar. Special thanks are due to my colleagues from other departments of this college and from English departments of other colleges present today here. And of course, my own departmental colleagues deserve to be thanked for their cooperation. Without Dr. Rudrashish Dotto, this webinar could not have happened. Thank you so much for being here today. I thank all our I thank all our students present here. Thank you. Those who presented papers, and they were wonderful papers, deserve a special thanks. And Dr. Shukhendu Kadar, who's not here today, but is busy with some other things, yesterday prepared for this department the PowerPoint which I presented. I thank him for his technical help. And now I request our Honorable Principal Ma'am to declare this webinar closed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Department of English, and my beloved students and the other colleagues who are present in this seminar. I'm sure that students have really enjoyed, and we have also enjoyed the seminar, because this was really a brainstorming one, and this is the real aim and this is the real target of holding this kind of seminar, that we can share and we can actually we can transfer our thoughts to our next generation, and we can discuss new things, whatever going on in our mind. So again, it's really a nice effort, and I'm sure that this kind of effort will be repeated by this department, and we will enjoy again. Now, good night to all of you, and I declare this session is closed. Thank you.
Good night. Good
Thank
night.
you. Thank you.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you, madam. Thank you, madam.